Welcome, everyone. I'm Olav Gjelsvik. I'm Director of CSMN, and we are extremely happy to have Professor Noam Chomsky with us. Let me just say that he is the most quoted writer in academia alive. No comparison at all with anybody else. And I think it's fair to say he is #1 public intellectual in the world. So please, Professor Chomsky, the floor is yours.
I'll talk some about Isaac Newton and his contributions to a study of mind. That he's not known for that, but I think a case can be made that he did make substantial, indirect, but nevertheless substantial contributions. I'd like to explain why. There is a familiar view that the early scientific revolution, beginning through the 17th century, provided humans with limitless explanatory power, and that conclusion is established more firmly by Darwin's discoveries, theory of evolution. I have in mind specifically a recent publication, exposition of this view by two distinguished physicists and philosophers, David Albert and David Deutsch. But it's commonly held with many variants. There's a corollary. The corollary is ridicule of what's called by many philosophers Mysterianism. That's the absurd notion that there are mysteries of nature that human intelligence will never be able to grasp. It's of some interest to notice that this belief is radically different from the conclusions of the great figures who actually carried out the early scientific revolution. Also interesting to notice how inconsistent it is with what the theory of evolution implies and has always been understood to imply since its origins. And I'd like to say a few words about those two topics in turn. Start with David Hume's A History of England. There's, of course, a chapter on the scientific revolution, and in particular on the crucial role of Isaac Newton, who he describes as the greatest and rarest genius that ever arose for the ornament and instruction of the species. And Hume concluded that Newton's greatest achievement was that while he seemed to draw the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, he showed at the same time the imperfections of the mechanical philosophy and thereby restored nature's ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. The mechanical philosophy, of course, was the guiding doctrine of the scientific revolution. It held that the world is a machine, a grander version of the kind of automata that stimulated the imagination of thinkers of the time, much in the way programmed computers do today. They were thinking of the remarkable clocks, the artifacts constructed by skilled artisans. Most famous was Jacques de Vaucanson, devices that imitated digestion, animal behavior, or the machines that you could find in the royal gardens as you walk through. They pronounced words when they were triggered, and many other such devices. The mechanical philosophy wanted to dispense with occult notions, neoscholastic notions of forms flitting through the air, sympathies and antipathies, other such occult ideas, and it wanted to be hard-headed to keep to what's grounded in common sense understanding. And it, in fact, provided the criterion for intelligibility from Galileo through Newton and indeed well beyond. Well, it's well known also that Descartes claimed to have explained the phenomena of the material world in such mechanical terms, while also demonstrating that they're not all-encompassing and don't reach into the domain of mind. his view. He therefore postulated a new principle to account for what was beyond the reach of the mechanical philosophy. And while this too is sometimes ridiculed, it's in fact full in accord with normal scientific, not scientific method. He was working within the framework of substance philosophy, so the new principle was a second substance, his res cogitans. And then there's a scientific problem that he and others faced, determining its character and determining how it interacts with the mechanical world. That's the mind-body problem cast within the scientific revolution, and it's a scientific problem. Well, it was for a time. The mechanical philosophy was shattered by Newton, as Hume observed, and with it went the notion of understanding of the world that the scientific revolution sought to attain. And the mind-body problem also disappeared, and I don't believe has been resurrected, though there's still a lot of talk about it. Those conclusions actually were pretty well understood in the centuries that followed. They've often been forgotten today. John Locke had already reached conclusions rather similar to Hume's. He was exploring the nature of our ideas, and he recognized, I'll quote him, that body, as far as we can conceive, is able only to strike and affect body and motion, according to the utmost reach of our ideas, is able to produce nothing but motion. These are the basic tenets, of course, of the mechanical philosophy. They yield the conclusion that there can be no interaction without contact, which is our all common sense intuition. And modern research and cognitive science has given pretty solid grounds for Locke's reflections on the nature of our ideas. It's revealed that our common sense understanding of the nature of bodies and their interactions, as nowadays we would say in large part genetically determined, it's very much as Locke described. Very young infants can recognize a principle of causality through contact, not in any other way. If they recognize causality, they seek a hidden contact somewhere. And those, in fact, appear to be the limits of our ideas, of our common sense. The occult ideas of the scholastics or of Newtonian attraction, it goes beyond our understanding and is unintelligible, at least by the criteria of the scientific revolution. Very much like Hume, Locke concluded, therefore, that we remain in incurable ignorance of what we desire to know about matter and its effects. No science of bodies is within our reach. And he went on to say we can only appeal to the arbitrary determination of that all-wise agent who has made them to be and to operate as they do in a manner wholly above our weak understanding to conceive. Actually, Galileo had reached much the same conclusions at the end of his life. He was frustrated by the failure of the mechanical philosophy, his ideal, its failure to account for cohesion, attraction, other phenomena, and he was forced to reject, quoting him, the vain presumption of understanding everything, or to conclude, even worse, that there is not a single effect in nature such that the most ingenious theorist can arrive at a complete understanding of it. Actually, Descartes, though more optimistic, had also recognized the limits of our cognitive reach occasionally. He's not entirely consistent about this. But Rule 8 of the Reguli reads, if in the series of subjects to be examined, we come to a subject of which our intellect cannot gain a good enough intuition, we must stop there, and we must not examine the other matters that follow, but must refrain from futile toil. Specifically, Descartes speculated that the workings of res cogitans, second substance, may be beyond human understanding. So he thought, quoting him again, we may not have intelligence enough to understand the workings of mind, in particular, the normal use of language, one of his main concepts. He recognized that the normal use of language has what has come to be called a creative aspect. It's every human being, but no beast machine, has this capacity to use language in ways that are appropriate to situations, but not caused by them. It's a crucial difference. And to formulate and express thoughts that may be entirely new, and to do so without bound, may be incited or inclined to speak in certain ways by internal and external circumstances, but not compelled to do so. It's the way his followers put the matter, which was a mystery to Descartes and remains a mystery to us, though it quite clearly is a fact. Descartes nevertheless continued that even if the explanation of normal use of language and other forms of free and coherent choice of action, even if that lies beyond our cognitive grasp, as it apparently does, that's no reason, he said, to question the authenticity of our experience. Quite generally, he said, free will, which is at the core of this, is the noblest thing we have, and there is nothing we comprehend more evidently and more perfectly, so it would therefore be absurd to doubt something that we comprehend intimately and experience within ourselves, namely that the free actions of men are undetermined, merely because it conflicts with something else which we know must be, by its nature, incomprehensible to us. Much like Locke, he had in mind divine preordination. One of the leading Galileo scholars, Peter Machimar, observes that by adopting the mechanical philosophy and thus initiating the modern scientific revolution, Galileo had forged a new model of intelligibility for human understanding with new criteria for coherent explanation of natural phenomena. So for Galileo, real understanding requires a mechanical model, that is, a device that an artisan could construct, at least in principle, hence intelligible to us. So Galileo rejected traditional theories of tides because, as he said, we cannot duplicate them by means of appropriate artificial devices. And his great successors adhered to these high standards of intelligibility and explanation. So it's therefore quite understandable why Newton's discoveries were so stridently resisted by the greatest scientists of the day. Christian Huygens described Newton's concept of attraction as an absurdity. Leibniz charged that he was reintroducing occult ideas similar to the sympathies and antipathies of the much ridiculed scholastic science. And he was offering no physical explanation for phenomena of the material world. And it's important to notice that Newton agreed, very largely agreed. He wrote that the notion of action at a distance is inconceivable. It's so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters a competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it. Philosophical means what we call scientific. By invoking that principle, he said, we concede that we do not understand the phenomena of the material world. So, and Newton scholarship recognizes that. I.B. Cohen, for example, or Duxerhouse, pick someone else, points out that by the word understand, Newton still meant what his critics meant, understand in mechanical terms of contact action. Newton did have a famous phrase, which you all know, the phrase, I frame no hypotheses. And it's in this context that it appears. He had been unable to discover the physical cause of gravity, So he left the question open. He said, to us, it is enough that gravity does really exist and act according to the laws which we have explained, and abundantly serves to account for all the motions of the celestial bodies and of our sea, the tides. But while agreeing, as he did, that his proposals were so absurd that no serious scientist could take them seriously, he defended himself from the charge that he was reverting to the mysticism of the Aristotelians. What he argued was that his principles were not occult, only their causes were occult. So in his words, to derive general principles inductively from phenomena and afterwards to tell us how the properties of actions of all corporeal things follow from these manifest principles would be a very great step in philosophy, in science, though the causes of the principles were not yet discovered. And by the phrase, not yet discovered, Newton, the word yet is crucial. Newton was expressing his hope that the causes would someday be discovered in physical terms, meaning mechanical terms. That was a hope that lasted right through the 19th century. It was finally dashed by 20th century science, so that hope is gone. The model of intelligibility that reigned from Galileo through Newton and indeed well beyond has a corollary. When mechanism fails, understanding fails. So Newton's absurdities were finally, over time, just incorporated into common sense natural science. You study them in school today, but that's quite different from common sense understanding. So to put it differently, one long-term consequence of the Newtonian revolution was to lower the standards of intelligibility for natural science. That is the hope to understand the world, which did animate the modern scientific revolution. That was finally abandoned. It was replaced by a very different and far less demanding goal, namely to develop intelligible theories of the world. So as such further absurdities as, say, curved space-time or quantum indeterminacy were absorbed into the natural sciences, the very idea of an intelligible, of intelligibility is dismissed as itself absurd. For example, by Bertrand Russell, who knew the sciences very well. By the late 1920s, he repeatedly places the word intelligible in quotes to highlight the absurdity of the quest. And he dismisses the qualms of the founders, the great founders of the scientific revolution, Newton, others, dismisses them as their qualms about action at a distance. He dismisses these as little more than a prejudice, although a more sympathetic and I think accurate description would be that they simply had higher standards of intelligibility. And if you look at the work of leading physicists, they more or less say the same thing. So a couple of years after Russell wrote, Paul Dirac wrote a well-known introduction to quantum mechanics, in which he says that physical science no longer seeks to provide pictures of how the world works, that is, a model functioning on essentially classical lines, but only seeks to provide a way of looking at the fundamental laws which makes their self-consistency obvious. So we understand the theories, we've given up trying to understand the world. He was referring, of course, to the inconceivable conclusions of quantum physics, but if modern thinkers hadn't forgotten the past, he could just as well have been referring to the classical Newtonian models, and which were undermined by Newton, undermining the hope of rendering natural phenomena intelligible. That was the primary goal, the animating spirit of the early scientific revolution. There's a classic 19th century history of materialism by Friedrich Lange, translated into English, with an introduction by Russell. Lange observes that we have so accustomed ourselves to the abstract notion of forces, or rather to a notion hovering in a mystic obscurity between abstraction and concrete comprehension that we no longer find any difficulty in making one particle of matter act upon another without immediate contact, through void space, without a material link. From such ideas, the great mathematicians and physicists of the 17th century were far removed. They were genuine materialists. They insisted that contact, immediate contact, is a condition of influence. This transition, he says, was one of the most important turning points in the whole history of materialism, deprived the notion of much significance, if any at all. And with materialism goes the notion of physical, of body, and other counterparts. They have no longer any significance. And he adds that what Newton held to be such a great absurdity that no philosophic thinker could light upon it is prized by posterity as Newton's great discovery of the harmony of the universe. Those conclusions are quite commonplace in history of science. So 50 years ago, Alexander Corre, another great historian of science and scientist, observed that despite his unwillingness to accept the conclusion, Newton had demonstrated that a purely materialistic pattern of nature is utterly impossible, and a purely materialistic or mechanistic physics as well. His mathematical physics required the admission into the body of science of incomprehensible and inexplicable facts imposed on us by empiricism, that is, by what we conclude from observations. Despite this recognition, the debates did not end. So about a century ago, Boltzmann's molecular theory of gases, or Kekulé's structural chemistry, in fact, even Bohr's atom, ones you all learn in school, these were only given an instrumental interpretation. Modern history of chemistry, standard history, points out that they were regarded as calculating devices, but with no physical reality. And Newton's belief that the causes of his principles were not yet discovered, implying that they would be, was echoed. It was echoed, by, for example, by Bertrand Russell in 1927. He wrote that chemical laws cannot at present be reduced to physical laws. Much like Newton, he hoped it would happen, and he expected that it would. But that expectation also proved to be vain as Newton's. Shortly after Russell wrote this, it was shown that chemical laws will never be reduced to physical laws because the conception of physical laws was erroneous. Finally done in Linus Pauling's quantum theoretic account of the chemical bond. Very much as in Newton's day, the perceived explanatory gap, as it's now called by philosophers, was never filled. Today, interestingly, just a few years ago, we read of the thesis of the new biology, that things mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains, though these emergencies are produced by principles that we do not yet understand. That's neuroscientist Vernon Mountcastle. He's formulating the guiding theme of a collection of essays reviewing the results of what was called the decade of the brain, last decade of the 20th century. His phrase, "we do not yet understand," might very well suffer the same fate as Russell's similar comment about chemistry 70 years earlier, or for that matter, Newton's much earlier one. In fact, in many ways, today's theory of mind, I think, is recapitulating errors that were exposed in the 1930s with regard to chemistry, and centuries before that with regard to core physics, though in that case leaving us with a mystery, maybe a permanent one for humans, as Hume speculated, actually asserted. Throughout all this, and today as well, we can optimistically look forward to unification of some kind, but not necessarily reduction, which is something quite different. Talk about reductionism is highly misleading. It's been abandoned over and over again in the history of science. Seeking unification, much weaker goal. Sometimes, in the case of, classic case of Newton and what he left veiled in mystery, that's may involve a significant lowering of expectations and standards. Well, let me go back to the beginning, the exuberant thesis that the early scientific revolution provided humans with limitless explanatory power. If we look over the history, I think a quite different conclusion is in order. The founders of the scientific revolution were compelled by their discoveries to recognize that human explanatory power is not only not limitless, but does not even reach to the most elementary phenomena of the natural world. That's masked by lowering the criteria of intelligibility, of understanding. Well, if we accept that much, as I think we should, a less ambitious question arises, the goals of science having been lowered to finding intelligible theories. Can we sensibly maintain, we can ask this, can we sensibly maintain that humanly accessible theories are limitless in their explanatory scope? It's a much weaker goal. And furthermore, does the theory of evolution establish the limitless reach of human cognitive powers in this narrower, more limited sense? Actually, if you think about it, the opposite conclusion seems much more reasonable. The theory of evolution, of course, places humans firmly within the natural world. It regards humans as biological organisms, very much like others. And for every such organism, its capacities have scope and limits to go together. That includes the cognitive domain. So rats, for example, can't solve, for say, a prime number maze. It's because they lack the appropriate concepts. It's not lack of memory or anything like that. They just don't have the concepts. So for rats, we can make a useful distinction between problems and mysteries. Problems are tasks that lie within their cognitive reach in principle. Mysteries are ones that don't. Mysteries for rats, they may not be mysteries for us. If humans are not angels, if we're part of the organic world, then human cognitive capacity is also going to have scope and limits. So accordingly, the distinction between problems and mysteries holds for humans. And it's a task for science to delimit it. Maybe we can, maybe we can't, but at least it's a formulable task. And not inconsistent. It's not inconsistent to think that we might be able to discover the limits of our cognitive capacities. Therefore, those who accept modern biology should all be Mysterians instead of ridiculing it, because Mysterianism follows directly from the theory of evolution, everything we believe about, scientifically believe about humans. So the common ridicule of this concept, right through philosophy of mind, what it amounts to is the claim that somehow humans are angels, exempt from biological constraints. And in fact, far from bewailing the existence of mysteries for humans, we should be extremely grateful for it. Because if there are no limits to what we might call, say, the science-forming capacity, it would also have no scope. Just as if the genetic endowment imposed no constraints on growth, it would mean that we could be at most some shapeless amoeboid creature reflecting accidents of an unanalyzed environment. The conditions that prevent a human embryo from becoming, say, an insect or a chicken, those very same conditions play a critical role in determining that the embryo can become a human. Can't have one without the other, and the same holds in the cognitive domain. Actually, classical aesthetic theory recognized that there's a relation between scope and limits. Without any rules, there can be no genuine creative activity, and that's even the case when creative work challenges and revises prevailing rules. So far from establishing the limitless scope of human cognitive capacities, modern evolutionary theory, and in fact all standard science, undermines that hope. Now that was actually appreciated right away when the power of the theory of evolution came to be recognized. One enlightening case is Charles Sanders Peirce and his inquiry into what he called abduction, which is rather different from the way the term is used today. Peirce was struck particularly by a striking fact that in the history of science, major discoveries are often made independently and almost simultaneously, which suggests that some principle is directing inquiring minds towards that goal under the existing circumstances of understanding. And something similar is true for early childhood learning. So if you put aside the pathology or extreme deprivation, children are essentially uniform in this capacity. And they uniformly make quite astounding discoveries about the world, going well beyond what any kind of data analysis could yield. In the case of language, it's now known that that starts even before birth. So a child is born with some conception of what counts as a language and can even recognize its mother's language as distinct from another language, both spoken by a bilingual woman who's never heard before. There's some interesting distinctions determining how it works, but can be done at birth. And in fact, even the first step of language acquisition, which is generally sort of just taken for granted, is quite a remarkable achievement. An infant has to select from the environment, from what William James called the blooming, buzzing confusion. The infant has to somehow select the data that are language related. That's a task that's a total mystery for any other organism. They have absolutely no way of doing it. But it's a reflexively solved problem for human infants. And so the story continues all the way to the outer reaches of scientific discovery. And it may not be continuous. I'm not suggesting that. There's probably different capacities involved. Rather like Hume, Peirce concluded that humans must have what he called an abductive instinct, which provides a limit on admissible hypotheses, so that only certain explanatory schemes can be entertained, but not infinitely many others, all compatible with available data. Peirce argued that this instinct develops through natural selection, that is, the variants that yield truths about the world provide a selectional advantage and are retained through descent with modification, Darwin's notions, while others fall away. That belief is completely unsustainable. It takes only a moment to show that that can't be true. And if you drop it, as we must, we're left with a serious and challenging scientific problem, namely determine the innate components of our cognitive nature, those that are employed in reflexive identification of language-relevant data or in other cognitive domains. To take one famous case, the capacity of humans, which is quite remarkable, to, if presented with a sequence of tachistoscopic presentations, just dots on a screen, 3 dots on a screen, presented with a sequence of these, what you perceive is a rigid object in motion. Some of the cognitive principles are known, but not the neural basis for it. Or, for example, discovering and comprehending Newton's laws, or developing string theory, or solving problems of quantum entanglement, or as complex as you like. And there is a further task, that's to determine the scope and limits of human understanding. Incidentally, some differently structured organism, some Martians say, might regard human mysteries as simple problems and might wonder that we can't find the answers or even ask the right questions, just as we wonder about the inability of rats to run prime number mazes. It's not because of limits of memory or other superficial constraints, but because of the very design of our cognitive nature and their cognitive nature. So actually, if you think it through, I think it's quite clear that Newton's remarkable achievements led to a significant lowering of the expectations of science, a severe restriction on the role of intelligibility. They furthermore demonstrated that it's an error to ridicule what's called the ghost in the machine. That's what I and others were taught at your age in the best graduate schools, Harvard in my case, but that's just a mistake. Newton did not exorcise the ghost. Rather, he exorcised the machine. He left the ghost completely intact. And by so doing, he inadvertently set the study of mind on quite a new course. In fact, made it possible to integrate it into the sciences. And Newton may very well have realized this. Throughout his life, he struggled, later life, struggled vainly, of course, with the paradoxes and conundrums that he followed from his theory, and he speculated that what he called spirit, which he couldn't identify, but whatever it is, might be the cause of all movement in nature, including the power of moving our body by our thoughts, and the same power within other living creatures, though how this is done and by what laws we do not know. We cannot say, he concluded, that all nature is not alive. Going a step beyond Newton, Locke added, that we cannot say that matter does not think. It's a speculation that's called the Locke suggestion in the history of philosophy. So as Locke put it, just as God had added to motion inconceivable effects, it is not much more remote from our comprehension to conceive that God can, if he pleases, superadd to matter a faculty of thinking. Locke found this view repugnant to the idea of senseless matter, but he said that we cannot reject it because of our incurable ignorance and the limits of our ideas, that is, our cognitive capacities. Having no intelligible concept of matter or body or physical, as we still don't, incidentally, but having no such concept, he said, we cannot dismiss the possibility of living or thinking matter, particularly after Newton had totally undermined common sense understanding permanently. Locke's suggestion was understood, and it was taken up right through the 18th century. Hume, for example, concluded that motion may be and actually is the cause of our thought and perception. Others argued that since thought, which is produced in the brain, cannot exist if this organ is wanting, and since there's no reason any longer to question the existence of thinking matter, it's necessary to conclude that the brain is a special organ designed to produce thought, much as the stomach and the intestines are designed to operate the digestion, the liver to filter bile, and so on through the bodily organs. So just as foods enter the stomach and leave it with new qualities, so impressions arrive at the brain through the nerves and are then isolated. They arrive isolated and without any coherence, but the organ, the brain, enters into action. It acts on them. It sends them back changed into ideas, which the language of physiognomy and gesture, or the signs of speech and writing, manifest outwardly. I'm still quoting. We conclude then with the same certainty that the brain digests, as it were, the impressions, that is, organically, it makes the secretion of thought, just as the liver secretes bile. Darwin who agreed with this, put the matter succinctly. He asked rhetorically, why is thought, being a secretion of the brain, more wonderful than gravity, a property of matter, a property that we don't understand, but we just came to accept? It's therefore rather odd to read today what I quoted before, the leading thesis of the decade of the brain that ended the last century, namely that things mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains, Mountcastle's summary. Strange to read that because it was commonplace in the 18th century, so it's not clear why it's an emerging thesis. And it's many other prominent scientists and philosophers have presented essentially the same thesis as, quote some contemporary examples, an astonishing hypothesis of the new biology, a radical new idea in the philosophy of mind, the bold assertion that mental phenomena are entirely natural and caused by the neurophysiological activities of the brain, opening the door to novel, promising inquiries, a rejection of Cartesian mind-body dualism, and so on. All of these reiterate, in virtually the same words, formulations of centuries ago, the traditional mind-body problem having become unformulable with the disappearance of the only coherent notion of body, again, physical, material, and so on. So, for example, Joseph Priestley's conclusion, 18th century, that properties termed mental reduce somehow to the organical structure of the brain, an idea, incidentally, which he developed in quite interesting ways, an idea which was stated in different words, less detailed by Hume, Darwin, many others, and almost inescapable, it would seem, after the collapse of the mechanical philosophy. Well, with the belated revival of ideas that were reasonably well understood centuries ago, and our direct conclusions of Newton's discoveries, we're left with scientific problems about the theory of mind. They can be pursued in many ways, like other questions of science, maybe with an eye to eventual unification, whatever form it may take, if any. That enterprise renews a task that Hume understood quite well. He called it the investigation of the science of human nature, the search for the secret springs and principles by which the human mind is actuated in its operations, including those parts of our knowledge that are derived from the original hand of nature. It's what we would call genetic endowment. Another, Hume, of course, is the arch-empiricist, but also a dedicated nativist. It's supposed to be the opposite of empiricism, and he had to be because he was reasonable. This inquiry, which Hume compared in principle to Newton's, had in fact been undertaken in quite sophisticated ways by English Neoplatonists, and work that directly influenced Kant. There's a contemporary, in contemporary literature, there are other names for this. It's sometimes called naturalization of philosophy, or epistemology naturalized, or sometimes just cognitive science. But in fact, it's the direct consequence of Newton's demolition of the idea of grasping the nature of the world, and inescapable. So let me just summarize briefly. I think it's fair to conclude that the hopes and expectations of the early scientific revolution were dashed by Newton's discoveries, which leaves us with several conclusions. One conclusion, actually reinforced by Darwin, is that while our cognitive capacities may be vast and scoped, they are nonetheless intrinsically limited. Some questions that we might like to explore may well lie beyond our cognitive reach, that we may not even be able to formulate the right questions. The standards of success may have to be lowered once again, as has happened before, very dramatically with the collapse of the mechanical philosophy. And another conclusion is that the mind-body problem can safely be put to rest, since there is no coherent alternative to Locke's suggestion. And if we adopt Locke's suggestion, that opens the way to the study of mind as a branch of biology, much like the study of the rest of the body, the body below the neck, putting it metaphorically. a great deal has been learned in the past half century of revival of traditional concerns of the early scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But many of the early leading questions have not been answered and may never be. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're going to open for questions and comments right away.
I have a question about mind, body. You just ended here with maybe we should just forget that dilemma. And my question to you is if you have thought about, instead of banish it, instead of just to forget it and put it in a bracket, then we can just add another factor, mind, body, and the senses, and see what happens. And my question to you is, have you anything to say about that combination?
Mind, body, and the senses?
Yes.
Well, mind, body is meaningless. If there's no body, there's no mind-body problem. And there hasn't been any concept of body since Newton. I mean, Newton still thought there was one, but as he put it, we haven't yet discovered it, meaning accounted for it in mechanical terms. But that's been given up, certainly by the 20th century. So there is no concept of physical. The term physical is just kind of like an honorific word, kind of like the word real when we say the real truth. It doesn't add anything. It just says, this is what serious truth. So to say that something's physical today just means you got to take it seriously. But there's no further concept of physical or material or body. So there can't be a mind-body problem. It's unformulable. There's a lot of work, you'll find plenty of articles on the mind-body problem.
I follow that, but if I follow that one. That one I understand.
Yeah, but now what about senses?
Yeah,
well,
if you add that...
Senses are part of the body. No,
If you... okay, thank you.
And we all agree, So there's some way in which the external world impinges on an organism, and the way that happens is what we call the senses, and we have different senses from other organisms. Like, there are other organisms much smarter than us. They can see ultraviolet light and hear things we can't hear and so on. But we all have our scope and limit with senses too.
You said that there was some kind of reduction of expectations of what an explanation should be when it was no more mechanical and not necessarily mechanical, understandable. And I wonder the relation between mechanical and material is, and also I've just been to a conference on Gregory Bateson, and he's very into this idea of information being a difference that makes a difference. And he says that a difference is intrinsically non-material. So the cybernetic causalities, they are non-material, but still mechanical. And then I wonder, what is the relation between mechanical and material, and could that be some of the problem?
Well, there can't be a relation because there's no such thing as material. That's like saying, what's the relation between information and ectoplasm? You can't ask that question till you tell us what ectoplasm is. And nobody can tell us what material is. Actually, when you look at modern physics, you have some pretty interesting proposals. There's a book, I don't pretend to understand it, but published by the American Physical Society, so I guess it's taken seriously by a very well-known physicist. I think he died recently, a physicist at the Institute for Advanced Study, John Wheeler, who argues that the only thing that exists in the world are bits of information, namely answers to questions that we pose to nature. That's all there is. Everything else is some kind of construct for those. So, from that point of view, all there is information. It's apparently not ridiculed by physicists, so I'm not able to ridicule it. And you understand what he means. What he's talking from the framework of quantum theory, which says this: what's there is our observations, the questions we pose to nature and the answers it gives back to us. And those are just bits of information. Everything else is constructed from that. It's a little bit like, say, Eddington and Russell, early 20s, saying that all that really exists is meter readings, and everything else is our construction from meter readings. So if physicists had the same illusions as psychologists and sociologists and others, they might call physics meter reading science, the way modern study of society and action is often called behavioral science. That's confusing the topic with the data for it, some of the data.
You were talking about the limits of understanding a little bit, and I was watching a clip on YouTube, I believe it was in 1971, and you were debating with a French philosopher, which is Foucault, I believe, I don't remember.
Michel Foucault.
And you were debating about, or his arguments were more, I guess, that the social limits that we impose ourselves are something that needs to be taught and needs to be enforced. While you were trying to say that it was something inherently in the human mind to have kindness and intelligence in order to be like social. My question is, what do you think is our limits for, or to be able to go in peace in a social context and start struggling? I believe in evolution. So I think that it's an evolution thing, but I think your philosophers are trying very, very hard to develop or to understand in order to be more social and peacefully creatures.
Yeah, not just philosophers, all of us are in our ordinary lives, raising children, whatever it may be. There's no real debate between, the debate was not about the importance of social factors, of course they exist. The debate was about what is taken to be contentious, but shouldn't be, the existence of innate factors. That's very commonly denied, and Foucault, in fact, was denying it. But it's just incoherent to deny it. If you deny it, then our cognitive and social behavior would be like some imagined organism, if you can imagine one, that doesn't have any genetic program that determines what kind of organism it'll be, and nothing that determines that it'll be an insect or a mouse or a human or whatever, and it therefore will be nothing. It'll be some amoeboid style reflection of accidental data. A lot of scientists have argued that, philosophers too. So Quine, for example, famously, I would say infamously, argued that language, but it would hold for, he held it for all behavior, in fact all theories, is just the result of it's a kind of an accidental collection of behaviors constructed developed through conditioning. It's essentially like saying we're all amoebas, amoeboid, not even an amoeba, because an amoeba has internal structure. It doesn't make any sense. You can't have any structure in an organism unless there's some form of predetermination. That form of predetermination will provide scope. It'll also impose limits. And there's just no way out of that. That's practically logic. Yes. But yes, to try to become more humane creatures is not just philosophers' quest. It should be a quest for all of us. Yeah.
What are the determination? What are the historical or scientific factors determining the scope of our understanding? And can we assume that the scope of our understanding have progressed since, say, the ancient times?
Well, as far as we know, human cognitive capacities have not changed for at least 50,000 years, when humans are some small group of hunter-gatherers left Africa, spread all over the world. We're all their descendants. Maybe a little more complex than that, but not a lot more. Now, we know that pretty well. It's like, it's not that anyone understands the biological nature of it, but there's very strong evidence. So, for example, if you take an infant from some tribe in Papua New Guinea that hasn't had other human contact for 40,000 years, and that's a possibility, And you take that infant and you bring it to Oslo and raise it from infancy in Oslo, it'll be indistinguishable from the people studying physics in Oslo University. It has the same cognitive capacities. And conversely, you take an infant from here and put it in that tribe in Papua New Guinea, it'll be able to do all the complex cognitive tasks that they can solve, but that you and I couldn't possibly solve. We couldn't survive there for a week. So it looks from evidence like, from evidence like that, which is maybe not conclusive, but is certainly powerful, it seems that cognitive capacities just haven't changed. In fact, humans are genetically very much alike as compared with other species. And it's not surprising because there's apparently a common origin not very long ago. 50,000 years is nothing in evolutionary time. It's an eye blink. So chances are that whatever the cognitive capacities were 50,000 years ago, they still are. Of course, they have to be brought out like other innate capacities. They have to be elicited by experience, but they're there, And I think that's, Hume wasn't thinking about evolution, of course, but when he talked about the common faculties that are given by the original hand of nature, I think must be what he meant. These were real problems in the 17th and 18th century. Remember that at the time of the early scientific revolution, that was also the time of the first real explorations. And explorers were finding all sorts of creatures that didn't look like Europeans, like Negroes and orangutans and so on. And they weren't sure how to distinguish them. So which ones, are some of them human or not? If you're a Cartesian rationalist, there's a sharp distinction between human and non-human. Cartesian rationalism is incompatible with racism. It's a point that historian of philosophy Harry Bracken has discussed at length. You can't be a rationalist and a racist. You either have a mind or you don't have a mind. And if you have a mind, it's the same. There's only one, so that's it. You can't. Empiricists, on the other hand, could be racist because there's you can have different properties. And these were hotly debated issues in the 17th and 18th century. They couldn't figure out what those other creatures were. Were they humans or weren't they? If they were, did they have rights? And if so, what rights? And so on. But of course, that's long past. And now there's just humans were apparently essentially all alike. And whatever there could be a study of what our common cognitive capacities are. In fact, it's studied quite a lot. So when you study what the way, say, infants determine the continuity of objects on the basis of very scattered data, you're essentially asking the kinds of questions that Descartes asked. Descartes actually, people don't, unfortunately, philosophers these days tend only to read the Meditations. But that's not Descartes. In fact, that was kind of propaganda. He even pointed that out. The famous letter he wrote to his friend Mersenne, where he said that the point of the Meditations is to try to convince the Jesuits to take his physics seriously. That's what he really cared about. When he wrote Principles of Philosophy, that means Principles of Science. That's the real stuff. And in that work, and in the optics and other things, he posed very interesting questions. He didn't carry out the experiments, but he carried out thought experiments, very much the way Galileo did. But if you carried them out, they'd probably come out his way. So like one was to ask the question, they said, imagine an infant who has had no experience with geometrical figures, okay? Which in fact is every infant, because geometrical figures don't exist in nature, just some other things. But so take an infant with no experience with geometrical figures, present that infant with a triangle drawn on paper. They said what the infant will perceive is a distorted triangle, not a perfect instance of whatever crazy figure it is, with the two lines not quite coming together, and one of them somewhat curved, and so on. And he regarded that as kind of paradoxical. Why should that be true? And if you're a thoroughgoing empiricist, you shouldn't permit that conclusion. In fact, since the conclusion is almost certainly correct, it's an easy refutation of standard empiricism. And his conclusion, Descartes' conclusion, was, well, we must have some innate system of, he would assume, Euclidean geometry, which we impose on data to yield our understanding, in fact, our perception. And there's quite a lot of work in the speculation through the 18th and 17th century on how this could be. And the basic ideas are probably correct. There's now a lot of experimental work and with infants and comparative work investigating it. And that is at the beginnings of work trying to find out what our cognitive capacities are. There's also work on something like rudimentary science forming, how do children develop a concept that the world acts in some rational fashion. A lot of this developed out of Piaget's work, even though it doesn't stand up as he presented it. That kind of work has been pursued. And that is, I think, the study of what you're asking. How far it can go, can it go up to what kind of scientific theories we can understand? Well, that's far off.
If we no longer consider materialism as relevant, but still we want to do philosophy, there should be an endeavor, there should be a point. What should the endeavor of philosophy be then? Is it pure consciousness? Is that what we are exploring? And if so, how do we go about to explore those limits of knowledge, and how do we practically do that? Because many people propose, for instance, that they can use psychedelic substances. And so are there some taboos that are stopping us from making that research that would be leaving materialism behind and moving on forward, considering different aspects of our experience or whatever? I'm not sure if I framed that right.
Well, I don't think we can leave materialism behind until somebody tells us what materialism is. I mean, that's kind of elementary. There was a concept of materialism right through the early scientific revolution, right through Newton. Newton still accepted it. In fact, the great scientists of the next century accepted it. Lagrange, others kept trying to develop a material, mechanistic concept of the universe that went right through the 19th century, ether theories and so on. It was finally given up in the 20th century. Finally recognized, look, we're never going to get it. And totally different ways of looking at things were developed, which have no relation to traditional materialism. Friedrich Lange is correct. And nobody's ever suggested another notion. Materialism just is like anything we more or less understand. It includes thinking, it includes reasoning, and so on and so forth. Locke's suggestion. So we can't leave it behind unless someone tells it what it is. But there's no reason why we can't study it. I mean, we can study what the human capacity of understanding is. In fact, we know some things about it. We know some negative things. For example, we can't understand the way the world works because our concept of understanding is too limited to incorporate what Newton described as an absurdity. People like Newton and Hume and Locke were not idiots. We have to take them seriously. They regarded it as an absurdity for very good reasons. And modern cognitive science, which somehow tries to recapitulate some of this, finds pretty much that. So, as I mentioned, an infant presented with presentations which indicate that there's some kind of causality, like, when the ball rolls this way, light turns red or something. They will invent a mechanical cause. And they don't care if it's not visible, because infants understand that most of what goes on is invisible. But there's got to be some mechanical cause, otherwise no way for it to influence anything else. So that does seem to be the way our minds work. And that tells us something about the limits of our understanding. In fact, a classical, crucial case. And it can go on to other cases. And we can study it directly. In principle, we can study it directly. It's not simple. I mean, it's not easy to understand why a rat can't deal with a prime number maze. Even that's hard. I mean, we have good evidence that it's true, but why it's true is unclear. There's nothing known about the brains of rats that explains why they can't do that. In fact, we can't explain why, the tiniest organism that's seriously studied, C. elegans, nematodes, 800 cells, 300 neurons, entire wiring diagram known. There's been years of study trying to explain why this thing, it goes left instead of right, let's say. It's just, we don't know how to explain that. There's an answer, but these are hard scientific questions. When you talk about how human intelligence works, it's incomparably more difficult. So you can ask the questions, you can cut away at them, but we shouldn't exaggerate. It's kind of striking that, going back to what philosophy ought to do, philosophers often appear to intend to want to get answers about humans that we can't get about insects. And that's too much, Science sort of works at the edges of understanding, and it faces hard questions all the way. So we can sort of talk about it, but if you want to seriously work on it, you have to take a look at what is understood and try to see if you can formulate questions which can be investigated and will tell us more about what's understood. Actually, there's interesting work going on this, having to do with things like the human moral instinct. In the past 20, 30 years, that's become an experimental subject with interesting experimental work on probably universal moral principles. A very important book just came out a couple of weeks ago by John Mikhail. He's a philosopher who now teaches law at Georgetown University, who gives a very acute, he more or less initiated this modern study. He didn't publish much, but other people have drawn off his work. Combination of reanalysis of traditional moral philosophy, mainly Rawls and his antecedents, and an analysis of a lot of the critique of Rawls, and then on to developing experimental programs to investigate some of these questions. And it's feasible. Maybe we can get some insight into innate human moral concepts that are cross-cultural, like you're going to find them in every culture, and that you can find with young children, pre any serious cultural impact. Those are all things that can be studied, and there's beginnings of studies.
I was wondering what you think about the prospects of genetic engineering and how that might perhaps expand our cognitive abilities, and thereby maybe also expanding the scope of what we're able to understand.
Well, in order to carry out genetic engineering, you have to understand something about the genetics of the traits that you're trying to deal with. So if Monsanto wants to genetically engineer, say, rice that'll be immune to some kind of disease, they have to understand something about what in the genetics of rice yields the susceptibility to disease. When we talk about human understanding, we haven't a clue what the genetics are. So you just can't even begin to ask a question. I mean, that raises an ethical question. Should we even try if we did know? But that ethical question is pretty far off in the distance because the genetics of it aren't understood. I mean, my own professional work is mostly on language. And even in the case of language, which is a small part of our cognitive capacity, kind of a central part, but a small part, and nobody has any idea very little idea what the genetics are. I mean, it's obviously there, and you can see its consequences, but to try to find it is very hard. And as I said, questions like that are not easy to answer about insects or tiny worms and so on.
Would you say that the search for these so-called particles, carriers of
of influence, like the Higgs boson in the photon, is that a search for a path back to contact action and therefore mechanical philosophy?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
It's the search for the photon, a return to
What
the sort of contact.
The
photon.
Yeah.
Oh, the Higgs boson.
Oh, the Higgs boson. Well, you know, there's a slight problem in physics. They can't find 90% of what the universe is made up of. But, you know, it doesn't mean an end to physics. You just look harder. And what they're searching for is the Higgs boson, which is supposed to be there. And if it is there, it can account for why particles have mass, hence energy. Otherwise, you just can't account for it. I mean, it's just assumed either it's there or something different from the standard model is correct. But you know, until it's found, you can't say whether it exists or whether the standard model that presupposes it is wrong. That's a very live question. They're spending billions of dollars trying to answer it in Switzerland, at CERN, things like that. The United States incidentally has given up on that question. Congress won't fund it.
Hi, my name is Timothy Chan. I'm a postdoc here at CSMN.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So, Professor Chomsky, you mentioned that you thought there is a legitimate scientific project to investigate where the limits of human understanding lie. So, whether a question is beyond our ability to answer. I just wonder what kind of evidence or inquiry do you think would be relevant to that? So just an example, in philosophy, Colin McGinn holds the view that the nature of consciousness or the explanatory gap, that's something that human beings are just never going to be able to answer. And I guess there's some affinity between his position and what you say. But then an objection to him that I'm sympathetic to is that, well, how do you know we cannot know? How do you know that if you give human beings 10,000 years, suppose that we haven't gone extinct by then, how do you know that you give 10,000 years, people aren't going to come up with new concepts that they don't now have? So how do you know that they are not going to be able to solve it? So I just wonder if you think there's a scientific evidence for this question. What kind of evidence would that be?
Well, first of all, we're talking about empirical questions. And in the case of empirical questions, you never know with certainty. That's what makes them empirical questions. Otherwise, they'd be questions of logic or maybe arithmetic. And even there, you can ask questions. But if it's empirical, we're never going to know with certainty. That's for sure. Well, it's true by definition. So the question really is, what evidence do we have and how good is the evidence? Well, in some cases, the evidence is pretty good. Like take the classical case, what Newton regarded as an absurdity. And again, I think you have to take people like Newton seriously, and Hume and Huygens and the rest of them. What they regarded as an absurdity is that there could be influence without contact. And while we don't know with certainty that that's the limits of human intelligence, there's pretty good evidence. If you study, first of all, we just have it from our own intuitions and from the history of centuries of efforts by the leading scientists to try to do something to overcome it, finally ending in failure and abandoning the quest. And we also know it, are beginning to understand it from just the experimental study of infants, children, things of the kind that I mentioned. They reflexively seek some kind of contact in order to account for correlations. Doesn't make sense otherwise. Well, physicists have finally given that up. They say, look, we're never going to find it. It doesn't exist. But how strong is that evidence? Well, you decide how strong it is. Looks pretty compelling to me. And if it is really the limits of our understanding, then nothing's going to change in 10,000 years, just as it didn't change in the last 50,000. What about things beyond that? Well, it's not an easy question to ask, even about other creatures like rats. but you can investigate it. Are you ever going to get certainty? No, you'll never have certainty because it's an empirical investigation. So that you don't bother looking for. As far as consciousness is concerned, it's a very hot topic these days. In fact, in philosophy, it's called the hard problem. Everything else is an easy problem somehow. But this is the hard problem. You go back to the 17th and 18th century, they also had something called the hard problem. Namely, how is motion possible? That was the hard problem. I mentioned, Newton wrestled with it, finally said it's impossible. We just have to accept it, even though we can't find what he called a physical cause. That was called the hard rock in philosophy. Voltaire, dedicated Newtonian, said that the fact that humans can cause motion by thought, like I can think, I want my hand to go over here and something will move. He said that's so inexplicable that it's got to be divine intervention. He was, of course, a pretty dedicated atheist by the standards of the time. But it looks as if we're stuck with that. And there seem to be, if we look further, there are many other things. Take, say, language, which is easier to study. There are impossible languages. You can construct things that look, symbol sequences, which are given interpretations and so on, but which have a structure that humans cannot learn. They may deal with it as a puzzle of some kind, but they can't deal with it as a linguistic task. There's by now pretty good experimental data on that. Well, that's the kind of thing you expect to find when you look at any organism, including our other cognitive capacities. As far as consciousness is concerned, I'm not so convinced that it's the hard problem. First of all, you have to formulate it coherently. What's the problem? I quoted Francis Crick, I didn't mention him, as saying that he has an astonishing hypothesis that consciousness comes from activity of the brain. That's Locke, Hume. Yes, they took that for granted. So that's the astonishing hypothesis. And then you can go to proceed, as he and others have done, to ask what's going on in the brain when people are conscious. Okay, that's serious work. Does it answer suppose you could get all those questions answered. Does it tell you what consciousness is? No, it leaves open the questions of consciousness. And in fact, we might ultimately be reduced to something like what Bertrand Russell thought. You read his analysis of matter, for example, which unfortunately isn't read much, but it's important, I think. I think it's 1928 or so. He says, look, the only thing we have any confidence in is our immediate consciousness. We may be wrong about it, but at least we have some degree of confidence in it. Everything else is an intellectual construction, including our conception of objects, our theory of the world, and so on. So that's, if you want, the hard rock, not too hard, because it could be wrong, but that's what we have to start with, and it's the best you can do as humans.
Okay, your political ideas, they have a foundation on ethics, yeah? Ethics, morality. And then I want to ask you, how is morality compatible with limited mind, determined human, as you put it, if I understood you well? Because in limited mind and determined human, I don't see a place for the free will, which is the base of morality in the human world. So what do you think about it?
About free will?
And morality, which is, of course, the base of politics and social,
human moral
ideas.
principles we can study, like the kind of work that I mentioned, John Michael, others, are carrying out the beginnings of experimental work, which sheds light on and may ultimately shed a lot of light on what our innate moral principles are, what Hume was looking for example, and Adam Smith and others. That could shed some light on it. So I don't think it's going to tell you much about freedom of the will. Freedom of the will, I think we're stuck pretty much where Descartes was. We just can't abandon believing it. It's our most immediate, phenomenologically obvious impression, but we can't explain it. And as he said, if there's something which we just know to be true and we don't have any explanation for it, well, too bad for our explanatory possibilities. But I don't see any way of getting around that. I mean, there's a lot of arguments that we don't have freedom of the will. And those arguments there's a ton of literature on that. And the literature is kind of interesting, actually, for reasons that William James discussed. He said, if you believe that there's no freedom of the will, why bother presenting an argument? You're forced to do it. The person you're talking to can't be convinced because there's no such thing as reasons. So why not watch a baseball game? That wasn't his example. But anybody who denies freedom of the will actually believes that it's there. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother presenting reasons. I mean, unless they say, look, I'm just forced to present these. I can't do anything else but present these reasons. Which is, yeah. And it's very, very odd, these discussions, many of them. Actually, you may have seen some experimental work which caused a big flurry a couple of years ago. Some neurophysiologists discovered that if a person's going to carry an act of willed action, let's say, pick this up, say, you can find activity in the motor centers of the brain before there's a decision to pick it up, okay? And that was held to show, okay, we've undermined freedom of the will. It doesn't say anything. All it says is what we ought to know anyway. Decisions are mostly made unconsciously. By the time they reach the level of consciousness, they've probably already been made. But that doesn't tell anything about how decisions are made.
But you didn't answer me, at least I didn't realize, I didn't perceive that I got an answer of, is it compatible, your teaching about determined humans and ethics, political ethics, morality and free will? That is what I ask. Is it compatible?
It's
or
compatible.
do you think it's incompatible and unexplainable? You said it's unexplainable.
Yeah, I don't understand why belief in certain ethical principles should be inconsistent with the belief that we have an ability to make choices. In fact, they seem totally consistent. Now, maybe it's all wrong, but they're consistent.
If somebody's determined, one cannot take a choice. That is the that's the base of.
Yeah, I don't understand what the alleged inconsistency is. In fact, I think it's more like what I thought you said before, that the commitment to moral principles basically presupposes freedom of the will. But I don't see any inconsistency.
She attributed some belief in genetic determinism to you, but you haven't committed to anything like
Yeah, there's genetic determinism, of course. That's why we're all humans and not insects, because that's our genetic endowment. That's genetic determinism. Just what follows from it, you have to look and see. We don't know.
My question relates to the previous question, actually. Free will. As a philosopher, I'd like to, you as a philosopher, I'd like to ask you this question. Studies have shown that decisions made in the brain actually appear some moments before an individual experiences them. Yeah. Well, how can you then say that there is such a thing as free will? I mean, thus, wiring, determinism, it proves that free will basically doesn't exist.
Yeah. Those are the experiments I was just referring to. There are some experiments which show that in a willed action, simple willed motor action, picking something up, there is activity in the relevant parts of the motor cortex before the decision to pick it up is conscious, okay? That tells us absolutely nothing about freedom of the will, except that choices are probably unconscious. But I think we know that without the experiments. What? Complicated? Oh yeah. Anything in this area is very when we understand nothing, everything's complicated. Yeah. It's another truism.
You do seem to imply that the theories of physics and chemistry are in some way constructs of our own imagination, and I wouldn't very much agree to that. But you also seem to imply some that they can be deconstructed in some way in biology. They can be deconstructed into the neurobiology of our brains. But what gives you the confidence that our scientific method
that our science is what?
Our scientific method.
Scientific method
is well, what gives you enough confidence in the scientific method to believe the evidence that biology gives us? There seems to be some innate skepticism in that system of thought, and to me, I would rather end up believing in nothing at all, not even that we do not believe anything, than actually believing in our own limitations. So, if we are so fundamentally limited as you claim we are, how can we have any confidence in the evidences providing the fact that we are limited?
A pure skeptic, you can give no answers to, which means that they're not asking sensible questions. We're only interested in sensible questions, the kind to which you can even imagine an answer, maybe a wrong answer. But if you can't even imagine an answer, it may have the form of a question, but it's not a question. Like, for example, if you were to ask, why do things happen? Okay, that happens to have the structure of an interrogative sentence, but it has no answers, no even imaginable answers, so therefore it's not a question, just has the structure of an interrogative. The pure skeptic, if one can be imagined, is posing things that look like questions but aren't really. As to how you can have confidence, well, first of all, you never have complete confidence if it's an empirical issue. In fact, you know, even arithmetic, you can't have complete I mean, it's known. You know, you can have non-standard models of arithmetic which satisfy the axioms but are different and so on. So, but in empirical questions, you develop confidence from experience, intuition, experiment, and so on. What's called the scientific method, but that's a funny term, because there really is nothing that's the scientific method. Like when you take, say, a psychology course, a program, you do take a course in methodology. But when you study physics, you don't take a course in methodology. There's no method other than being reasonable, you know. And learning from what has been done and seeing if you can carry it forward and so on. In fact, the courses in methodology that you take, say, in psychology or sociology are mostly courses in statistics and techniques you can use. But scientific method is, you know, just whatever way we have of dealing with the world rationally, reasonably. Can we have confidence in it? No, maybe it's misleading us, just as rats are consistently being misled about mazes. We can understand it for them, but if that's true, all we can do is try to see if we can use the same rational approaches to see if we can figure out what the limits of our intellectual capacities are. And we have some examples in which I think can have fair confidence, like the collapse of the intuitively obvious fact that interaction requires contact.
I don't know much about physics, so I'm going to ask this like simply, and maybe you already answered this. Do you reject the possibility of a non-physical reality interacting with this physical reality? And do you like acknowledge the possibility of it through seeing the effects it might have on the physical reality? I'm thinking of like the study of like the smallest entities of an atom. And yeah, and also just the power of attraction, what is it?
Well, the two of us share something. I don't understand physics either, so we're in the same, but, and in fact, I don't think physicists understand it, and they're pretty open about it, but But see, you can't ask the question about interaction between physical and non-physical until you tell us what physical means. Okay, you've at least got to be able to tell us what physical means in order for the question to be answered. But there hasn't been any concept of physical for hundreds of years. There was one in the early scientific revolution, a very intuitive concept of the physical. That's what inspired Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, Lagrange, many others all throughout the modern history of science. But it's been recognized, but it was already recognized after Newton that it's gone, like Locke recognized it, Hume recognized it. For Hume, it's not only gone, it's a total mystery beyond our intellectual capacities. And that we can speculate about, but it's certainly gone. And no one has proposed anything else. The physical these days are things that Newton would have regarded as total absurdities, like curved space-time. How can that be physical? Quantum entanglement. I mean, Einstein regarded that as non-physical because it's so absurd. But now scientists